I pray that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. But what are they among so many people? Now, those weren't just the words of Jesus' disciple Andrew from our gospel story this morning. Those were also the approximate words of my mother-in-law as she looked at how many brats her son and I were about to put on the grill. All right. See, we were in Michigan a few weeks ago for a family reunion, and Andrea's brother and I pulled grill duty for the family picnic at the park. And in the Midwest, when families get together to be outside and grill something in the 4 weeks a year that it's actually warm enough to do that, well then 9 times out of 10, they're grilling brats, okay? And it's always on a Weber. Somehow they figure out a way to pass that into law somehow. Now, my mother-in-law, she was in charge of organizing this cookout, and she has a tendency to be a bit of a worrier about these sorts of things. She's always wanting to make sure that there's enough to go around, and she was standing there looking at the pile of brats that we had brought in, and she didn't think there was going to be enough there to feed everyone. Hence the, what are they among so many people? Now, Andrea's brother didn't agree, and he tried to assure her that no, we were fine, not to worry. There would be plenty of greasy sausage for everyone who wanted some. And yet, not worrying about the brats for her cousin Mark to get enough that he wanted, that in her mother's case is a way that she cares for people. It's a sign of how thoughtful she really is about wanting those to be taken care of. But it speaks to something deeper, actually, that we all struggle with in our lives. And that is the question of, how much is enough? And I can't even imagine how many hours of our lives we spend worrying about if we have enough of something. If we have enough food or money or toys or stuff, or if we have enough help or love or peace or purpose in our lives or friends or brats or whatever. I mean, if you name it, then we worry about if we have enough of it. And the truth is, it doesn't matter if we have a lot of something or if we just have a little bit of it, we still worry if we have enough. And yeah, there are reasons for this, and reasons we all know about. The psychologists call it the scarcity mentality, which is where we feel like we need to get and to have and to consume and to take and to hoard everything that we possibly can because there's only so much of everything out there to go around, right? And if we don't have it, well, then someone else is going to get it, and then we won't have enough of it. And so there's that, but there's also just our human tendency to always want more. I mean, if a lot is good, right, well, then more is even better than good. I mean, that just makes sense. It's somewhat logical to us. But the issue is that if we can't get more, because we don't know how to or we can't afford to or whatever, and if we're constantly worrying about if we have enough, well, all of that worry and anxiety gets to the point where our hearts and minds, they tend to lose their way just a bit. We become so consumed by what we can't have or by what we don't have that we can no longer even see and appreciate the things that we do have in our lives. But thankfully, Jesus comes again to us this morning into this world we live in with its scarcity mentality and our constant worry about not having enough, as we hear the very familiar story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with the boys' 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. And it's for a very good reason that this is one of the most famous miracles that Jesus did. I mean, it's a powerful event, a game changer, I guess you could say, as after it, people begin to see Jesus in a whole new way, a whole new level of what he was capable of. In fact, this story is so important. It's the only miracle story that all 4 of the gospel writers actually write about. Now, I remember when I was first old enough and smart enough to start thinking about Bible stories in a more practical level, right? It was about the time I turned 40 or so, I think. Now, of course, everyone has questions about the Old Testament, right? I mean, the stories, because some of the stories in the Old Testament, well, they're just flat out weird. And they're practically speaking, they sound impossible to us, right? There's Jonah and the whale, all the animals on the ark, Lot's wife turning into salt, burning bushes, and even donkeys that can speak and talk about things. All the usual suspects, those stories. But that's the Old Testament. And there's a lot of things, very complicated things, going on in the Old Testament, and those stories were needed by God's people to help them understand those things. But this story of Jesus as the great multiplier, this was always one of the ones that caught my attention, quite substantially. I mean, first of all, because again, we're not talking about strange stories from the Old Testament, we're talking here about the life and actions of Jesus. And also because, for me, I wanted to try and understand this story on a logical and practical level. And I wanted to be able to wrap my brain around it and understand exactly how he did it. I mean, literally, what does it look like to make 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread enough for thousands of people? I mean, is it some sort of magic trick that Jesus can do? Is it a multiplying superpower that he has? I mean, maybe you haven't seen, but recently I saw Incredibles 2 with my kids, and Jack the baby can multiply into many things. If you don't know what that's about, don't worry about it, but it's funny. Maybe it's like the herb, mint. Have you ever made the mistake of planting that herb in your garden before, and it just seems to multiply endlessly, and for years on end you can't get rid of it? I mean, how can 2 suddenly become more than 2? How does that happen? It's kind of hard to figure it out. And some people actually can't believe it. They just can't quite get there. And so there are many people who try and explain this story in such a way that is much less miraculous. I mean, one common explanation is that the little boy's generosity in giving what he had brought, so much inspired the people around him that they too started to share what they had, and soon enough it became, enough for all. And that's a nice little interpretation. There's a good moral lesson in there. But all of this and all of that, it misses the point. Jesus isn't here to teach us tidy little moral lessons. He's here to change our lives. The truth is that we can't know exactly how it worked or what the process was like during multiplication. I mean, we can't get all the details of these stories, but I have grown into the realization that honestly, it really just isn't that important. Because instead of worrying about all the details, we instead need to be focused on what the story actually means for our lives. And if you put it very simply, it's this. There were a lot of people following Jesus. They needed to eat. The disciples were worried there wasn't enough food for everyone. There was no place for them to buy it. So Jesus has his own picnic in the park. He sits everyone down. He took the boys' food, the same food that Andrew had looked at and wondered, what are these among so many people? He gives thanks for it. He blesses it and passes it out. And everyone has not just enough to be satisfied, but they have way more than they could ever have hoped to eat. Out of his compassion and his mercy for those who are in physical need around him, Jesus, in his abundant love, provided for them. That's the point of the story. You see, this story, it's powerful not because of the details, but because of what it means for all of God's people. And in that vein, too, I do think it's helpful for us to understand how the author of John, who was writing about this, how he understood what Jesus did. Because you see, in all 4 of the Gospels, the writer of John, he has a very unique perspective on the miracles that Jesus did. I mean, for starters, he doesn't even actually call them miracles. He calls them signs that Jesus did, and for a reason. Now, obviously, it was good for the people that benefited from the miracles that Jesus did. But the reason John calls them signs is because more than just helping people, it's in doing these miracles, these signs, that Jesus is revealing who he is, and so then also, by extension of that, who God is, since they are one. I mean, it'd be like a billboard you passed on I-81. Jesus' miracles are a sign that tell us who he is and what he is about. And so in this story, the real importance of Jesus' activity isn't just to feed those who are hungry, even though that's a wonderful, awesome, amazing thing. That's great. But in John's eyes, the point is that this story, through the actions of Jesus, we are learning something important about God. And so then again, what does this story tell us about God? Well, that our God is an extravagant God. He's a God of abundance who recklessly gives to us, who provides again for us so much in excess that there are leftovers that can fill baskets upon baskets. And the good news for us today, it is that through Jesus, it is this God of abundance who wades into our world of worry and, it's never going to be enough. He overpowers our fears and our anxieties about needing more and wanting more by reminding us again this morning that we might not have all of the things that we really feel like we want in our lives, but we do have the things that we need. Through his grace and his love, we have hope, we have healing. Through his mercy and his forgiveness, we have new chances every single day to make right all of the things that we've done wrong. And through the Spirit, we have power and purpose to meet the challenges that come to us day in and day out. Through the sacraments, we have the gift of life with him and how we are sustained through them. And through his church, he's given us a community, a place of acceptance, a place where we can always go to have relationship with him. And all of these things, God has given them to us freely, purely out of his abundance. He feeds us with spiritual food. And as Jesus will say in the weeks ahead where we talk about bread over and over, he said, this is the kind of food that actually lasts. It's not just going to fade away, so like you're eating lunch and you're already wondering what you're going to have for dinner somewhere. The only way that we will ever find peace in our lives is to let our fear and our worries about having enough is just to let them go. The only way we can do that is to turn from what we think we need to focus and instead be grateful for the things in our lives that we already have. In one of my previous churches I served, we had a large group of Sudanese people who were a part of our community. And if you've ever been around anyone from Sudan, they are wonderful people, very gracious and kind. But there was this one man particularly, his name was Matthew, who to this day still remains fixed in my mind, and whenever I kind of catch up with him, he hasn't changed a bit. Because you see, Matthew was one of the lost boys of Sudan. And if you don't know who the lost boys of Sudan are, it's actually a very painful story to tell. See, in 1987, a civil war broke out in Sudan that drove, I think there's an estimated about 20,000 boys, most of them who were just 6 or 7 years old, which is the age of my youngest son, Ezra, drove them from their families and their villages in South Sudan. They were attempting to flee to Ethiopia because they were trying to escape torture and death or being conscripted into the northern Sudan army. And this travel to Ethiopia was 1,000 miles away. They estimate that about half the boys died on the journey, 10,000 of them lost on the way. And the survivors, what was left, about half, did make it to a refugee camp in Kenya. Now, the survivors of this tragic exodus became known as the Lost Boys of Sudan because they had nothing and no family. And in 2001, about 4,000 of what was left of the boys were brought to the U.S., and Matthew was one of them. He was resettled in the Sudanese community in Grand Rapids, and having an Anglican background, he found his way to our Lutheran church. And as I became friends with Matthew, I learned a bit more about what he had seen in his life and how he had lost basically everything in it. He had spent most of his life with just one shirt, the shirt that he had on his back, as he struggled to find some place in this world where he could actually feel safe. He had lost everything. He'd lost everyone who was ever close to him in terrible tragedies that would have outraged the world if it hadn't happened to a 6-year-old boy in South Sudan. And yet, if you talk to Matthew, and many people did, the one characteristic that you could say about him was that he had an unbelievable spirit of gratitude. Gratitude. Every time I saw him, he would talk to me for 10 minutes about how grateful he was for what he had in his life, how grateful he was for how God had blessed him, and what God had given him. And yet, by our standards, think about that. He had nothing. No family, no savings account or 401k, no car, no gadgets, no newest gadget, no education that even would even assure him of some sort of job out there. But he said that he had learned at a very, very young age, and he had learned this painfully, that he said he learned to value his life and the things in it in a very different, very unworldly way. You know, the things of this world, they come and go, he would say. The stuff, absolutely, but yes, even the people. Then he would say that the promises and the love of God, those don't go away. They stay forever. And so that's how they become all we ever really need. I mean, I don't think we can, but can you imagine having been through all that Matthew had and still be able to see the world the way he did? It's a very stark reminder about how much time and energy we waste worrying about things that in the long run, they don't really even matter that much at all. So just how much is enough? It's not an easy question. There's no easy answer. And if we focus on the wrong things, we will feel like we never have enough. But if we can look to the things not of this world, if we look to the gifts given to us by an abundant God, the God who showed us in that picnic in the park that Jesus threw who he really is, well, then we'll have all that we ever could possibly need. Amen.